Chapter 6. Blood and Pact. The scent of damp earth and distant rot filled the air as Thomas and Alara moved through the thick underbrush. Their earlier training had sharpened them, but now it was time to put their skills to the test. They had wandered into the remnants of a long-forgotten battleground, rusted weapons and skeletal remains half buried in the moss, a lingering sense of death still clinging to the place. "This feels wrong," Alara muttered, fingers resting on her daggers. "Like something's watching us." Thomas felt it too, a strange, pulsing presence at the edge of his awareness. Not quite hostile, but curious. Something was here. He knelt, pressing his palm to the earth, focusing. His summoning power flickered, reaching into the decay around them. A connection snapped into place. A deep growl rumbled through the clearing. Then, movement. A shadow peeled itself from the ruins, a massive beast, its body stitched from remnants of fallen creatures. It had the skeletal frame of a great hound, wrapped in rotting sinew and patches of fur. 4 glowing eyes burned in its skull, fixed on Thomas. Alara tensed. "What the hell is that?" Thomas exhaled, his pulse steady despite the threat. A remnant of the dead. The beast didn't charge. Instead, it bowed its head. Something clicked in Thomas's mind. "It's not here to kill me. It recognizes my power." He took a cautious step forward. The beast didn't flinch. Alara shot him a sharp look. "Thomas, what are you doing?" "Testing something." His fingers twitched as he extended his will. The air thrummed. The bond between them solidified. A message burned into his vision. "You have encountered a wild necrohound. This creature is bound to the lingering death in this area. Its will is unclaimed. Attempt to bind. A choice." Thomas grinned. "Yes." A violent shockwave of power surged through him, his veins turning to ice for a brief second. The necrohound shuddered, its glowing eyes flickering. Then, it lowered itself onto one knee. Submission. Alara let out a slow breath. "You just made that thing yours?" Thomas smirked. "Seems like it." A new alley, a new path. They set up camp near a twisted old tree, the necrohound looming beside them like a silent guardian. Alara kept glancing at it. "I don't know if I should be impressed or concerned." Thomas chuckled. "Both?" She shook her head, amused. "You keep pulling shit like this, and people are going to start fearing you." His smirk faded slightly. "They already will." Silence. Alara studied him, her gaze lingering. "You really don't mind, do you?" He looked at her. "Mind what?" She leaned back, propping herself up on her elbows. "What you're becoming. The way your power works. It's dark." He exhaled. "I don't see it as good or evil. It just is, and I'll use it however I need to survive." A pause. Then, she smirked. "I like that about you." His eyebrow raised. "Oh?" Alara chuckled. "You don't flinch from what you are. A lot of people would. Hell, I probably would." Thomas held her gaze. "And yet, here you are." She shrugged. "Guess I like the thrill." For a moment, the tension between them shifted, not the unease of battle, but something else. Something that made Thomas's heart beat a little faster. Alara noticed it too. Her smirk deepened slightly, but she didn't push. Instead, she flicked her dagger, pointing at the necrohound. "You gonna name that thing?" Thomas glanced at the beast. It watched them both, eerily still. "A name." He grinned. "How about Revenant?" The necrohound growled in approval. The bloodied road ahead. They rested that night, the campfire casting long shadows. Thomas's bond with Revenant pulsed in the back of his mind, a constant awareness of the creature's presence. He felt stronger. More complete. Alara spoke quietly beside him. "We should move at first light. If there are creatures like that here, there could be worse." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, and I want to see how far this power really goes." She chuckled. "Of course you do." The fire crackled, and for the first time since they met, Alara moved closer, her shoulder brushing his. Not fear. Not hesitation. Just acceptance. Thomas grinned to himself. They were getting stronger. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 7. Bound in blood. The wind howled through the twisted remains of the battlefield, carrying the distant cries of unseen creatures. The scent of old death clung to the air, a reminder of what this place once was. Thomas stood at the edge of the camp, his hand resting on Revenant's thick, sinewy hide. The necrohound was motionless, its glowing eyes scanning the darkness, ever vigilant. Behind him, Alara sat by the fire, sharpening one of her daggers. Sparks danced with each slow, deliberate motion of the whetstone. "You've been quiet," she said without looking up. Thomas exhaled. "Just thinking." She smirked. "That's dangerous for you." He chuckled, but his gaze remained fixed on the distant ruins ahead. Something about this place called to him. It was more than just the presence of death, it was familiar. As if his power had roots here. Alara studied him for a moment, then tossed her dagger into the dirt. "All right, spill it." He turned to her. "Spill what? You feel something, don't you?" Thomas hesitated. "Maybe." She stretched her arms behind her head. "Figures. You've been different since you bound that thing." She nodded toward Revenant, who let out a low growl in response. "It's not just the summoning," Thomas admitted. "It's like I understand this place. Like my power was meant for it." Alara's expression darkened slightly. "And that doesn't freak you out?" He smirked. "Not in the slightest." She scoffed. "Of course not. You enjoy this shit too much." Thomas stepped closer, crouching beside her. "And what about you? You could have left at any time." Alara met his gaze, her smirk fading just slightly. "Yeah, I could have." A beat of silence. Then, she reached for her dagger, flipping it between her fingers. "You want to explore whatever's calling to you?" He nodded. She sighed. "Then let's go find out what kind of mess we're getting into this time." The depths of the Forgotten, the ruins loomed ahead, jagged stone structures jutting from the earth like the skeletal remains of a forgotten civilization. Thomas moved forward without hesitation, Revenant pacing silently beside him. Alara followed a step behind, her hands hovering near her weapons. As they stepped deeper into the ruins, the air grew thicker, heavy with something old. Then, Thomas saw it. A massive stone door, covered in decayed runes. It was cracked slightly open, a faint, eerie light spilling from within. Alara narrowed her eyes. "You're seriously thinking about going in there?" Thomas smirked. Of course, she muttered. He placed a hand on the cold stone and pushed. The door groaned. The sound like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Beyond the threshold lay a vast chamber, lined with bone-white pillars and flickering ghostly torches. And at the center, a figure. It sat on a stone throne, wrapped in decayed ceremonial robes. A crown of bone rested atop its withered skull, its empty sockets burning with a faint blue light. Thomas's breath caught. He knew this thing. Not from memory, but from instinct. The entity slowly raised its head. "Ah. So you are the one," it rasped. Alara tensed. "Thomas." He stepped forward. "You know me?" The figure chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Not yet, but you walk the path of the Forgotten. And now, you stand before the first of many choices." A new system prompt flared to life in Thomas's vision. "You have encountered an ancient revenant. This entity recognizes your potential. A bond may be formed. Will you accept the pact of the Forsaken? Yes? No?" Thomas stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Alara edged closer. "Thomas, don't just blindly agree to some undead crypt lord's deal." The ancient revenant let out a breathy chuckle. "You fear what you do not understand, mortal." Alara scowled. "Yeah? And what exactly would he be agreeing to?" The revenant's eyes flared slightly. "Power. True power. The kind that bends the dead not as mindless slaves, but as devoted warriors. The kind that makes the abyss your ally, not your enemy." Thomas exhaled. "And what's the price?" The revenant grinned, a chilling sight. "You will walk the path of the Forsaken. There is no return to the light. Only the abyss, and the strength that comes with it." A thrill coursed through Thomas's veins. No return to the light. He had never belonged to the light in the first place. He met the revenant's burning gaze and grinned. "I accept." The chamber shook. A surge of dark energy slammed into Thomas's body, sending him to his knees. His veins burned, his mind split open, and a voice whispered in the depths of his soul. "You have chosen the Forsaken path. Your bond with death deepens. New ability unlocked. Sovereign of the Fallen, your summons are no longer mere constructs. They are warriors who retain echoes of their past lives. Their strength grows alongside yours. New title unlocked. Forsaken Lord, your presence alone unsettles the living." Dark beings recognize you as kin, and some may serve willingly. When Thomas opened his eyes, the world felt different, more alive. More, his. Alara grabbed his arm. Are you still you? He smirked, standing up. I'm more than I was. The revenant on the throne laughed. You have chosen well, young one. Now, go, and claim what is yours. Thomas turned to Alara, his eyes burning with new power. She studied him for a long moment, then smirked. All right, guess we're really doing this. Thomas grinned. Damn right we are. And as they stepped out of the ruins, Revenant growling at his side, Thomas knew. This was only the beginning. Chapter 8. Baptism in darkness. The ruins behind them pulsed with an eerie glow. But Thomas felt no fear, only power. His body was different now. He could feel it in the way his muscles coiled, the way his breath no longer faltered, the way the shadows stretched toward him like old friends. His new title, Forsaken Lord, was more than just a name. It was a claim, a mark upon his soul, and he was ready to test it. Alara walked beside him, silent. She had been watching him carefully since the moment he accepted the pact of the Forsaken, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign that he was no longer himself. She wouldn't find one, because he was still Thomas. Just more. The night was thick with tension as they moved through the ruined landscape. Revenant, his summoned hound, prowled at his side, its glowing eyes cutting through the dark. Then the first test came. A low, guttural snarl echoed from the tree line ahead. Thomas stopped. Alara's hand went to her daggers. More trouble? A shape emerged from the shadows. Then another. Pale, twisted figures crawled from the darkness, their bodies elongated, their eyes black pits that swallowed the moonlight. They were wraith spawn, cursed creatures that fed on lingering souls. Thomas felt no fear. The creatures hesitated, sniffing the air. Their bodies trembled as they recognized something in him. The Forsaken Lord. Thomas smiled. Kneel. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the weight of his power carried through the night. One of the wraith spawn shuddered and collapsed to its knees. Another followed, its mouth splitting open in a silent scream. Alara stiffened beside him. What the fuck? Thomas stepped forward, his newfound authority pressing into the creatures like an unseen hand. This was his power, not just to raise the dead, but to command them. He reached out, and the nearest wraith spawn writhed as a dark thread of energy lashed between them. A new notification flashed in his vision. New passive unlocked. Call of the Forsaken, lower undead will submit to your will. Stronger undead may resist, until you prove your strength. The wraith spawn shivered as Thomas tightened his grip on its very being. He could feel its hunger, its emptiness, and he filled it. A black surge ran from his fingertips into the creature. Its spine arched, and for a moment, it looked like it might burst apart. Then it changed. The once mindless wraith spawn rose, its body shifting. Its bones realigned, its limbs thickened, its empty black eyes now smoldering with violet fire. Thomas grinned. His first converted soldier. The remaining wraith spawn howled in terror and fled. Alara exhaled. That was something. Thomas turned to her, his eyes still burning with the afterglow of his power. It's only the beginning. She gave him a wary smirk. Remind me to never piss you off. He chuckled. Oh, I'll remind you. She rolled her eyes but didn't look away from him for a long time. The limits of power. They made camp at the edge of a crumbling temple, the remnants of stone pillars jutting from the ground like broken teeth. Thomas sat with his back against the ruins, watching his new creation. The reborn wraith spawn, now something more. He hadn't expected the transformation, hadn't realized just how deep his power ran, and yet, something felt off. His breath had been slow all night. Too slow. His heartbeat was steady, but not quite right. Was this the price the Revenant spoke of? Alara sat across from him, watching. All right, spill it. He raised an eyebrow. What? You've been staring into the abyss for the last hour. And that thing? She nodded toward the kneeling wraith spawn, hasn't stopped staring at you either. Thomas exhaled. I think I changed more than I realized. Alara frowned. Define change. Thomas ran a hand over his chest. I feel different, stronger, but also, he hesitated. She leaned forward. But also what? His eyes flicked to her. Less alive. Alara didn't speak immediately. Then she stood, stepping toward him. He tensed slightly as she placed a hand on his chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she whispered, "Your heart's still beating." He smirked. "That's a relief." She gave him a dry look. "Don't be an idiot. If something starts changing, I need to know." He studied her. "Why?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "Because I need to know if you're still you." Something unspoken hung in the air between them. Then, slowly, her hand lingered against his chest a moment too long before she pulled away. Thomas chuckled. "Starting to like me, Alara?" She rolled her eyes, but there was no bite to it this time. "Don't push your luck." He grinned. "Too late." She shook her head, but she was smiling. And for the first time that night, Thomas felt grounded. Even in the darkness, even with his power growing beyond his understanding, even with the whispers of the abyss clawing at his mind. She was still here, and that meant something. A shadow on the horizon. Their moment of quiet didn't last. A distant howl cut through the night. Not like revenants. Not like the wraith spawns. This was something else. Something bigger. Revenant snarled, rising to its feet. The newly converted wraith spawn trembled, its violet eyes flicking toward the horizon. Alara drew her daggers. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is." Thomas stood, his pulse steady. "That depends." Alara's face darkened. "Is it a goddamn apex predator?" A shadow moved on the distant ridge, then another, then many. Large, hulking figures. Their bodies wrapped in corrupted flesh, their eyes burning like embers. They were watching. Waiting. Alara exhaled sharply. "Shit." Thomas grinned. "Looks like we're about to find out what my new power can really do." Alara shot him a look. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" His eyes gleamed in the firelight. "More than I should." She shook her head. "You're a goddamn maniac." He unsheathed his weapon, the shadows at his feet writhing in anticipation. "And you're stuck with me now." Alara sighed. Yeah, just don't die before I figure out if I actually like you or not." Thomas laughed, stepping toward the approaching darkness. The hunt was on. Chapter 9. Baptized in blood. The air was thick with tension, humming with the promise of violence. Thomas and Alara stood side by side, staring at the ridge where shadows loomed, monstrous figures shifting against the moonlight. Revenant growled low, its glowing red eyes fixed on the approaching threat. The newly converted wraith spawn trembled at Thomas's feet, waiting for its master's command. Alara adjusted the grip on her daggers, her body coiled with anticipation. "So, fearless leader, got a plan?" Thomas smirked, his fingers flexing. Power thrummed beneath his skin, dark energy curling like smoke in his palms. "Yeah, we kill them all." Alara snorted. "Fantastic strategy. Flawless. Really?" A howl split the night. Then the creatures charged. 6 of them. Large, twisted humanoid beasts. Their flesh stretched tight over corded muscle, their eyes glowing embers in the dark. Their bodies bore remnants of something once human, but now corrupted beyond recognition. Their claws dripped with black ichor, and their teeth gnashed as they sprinted forward, fast and hungry. Thomas felt his blood ignite. A new notification flickered in his vision. Forsaken domain activated. When surrounded by death, your power surges. All summoned creatures gain increased strength and resilience. The moment they crossed into his range, Thomas commanded, "Revenant, rip." The hound exploded forward, moving like a streak of darkness, jaws snapping onto the throat of the first creature. A sickening crunch echoed as it tore a chunk of flesh away, black ichor spraying across the ground. But the beast didn't stop. Even half its neck missing, it kept coming. Alara darted into motion, a blur of speed as she slipped under one of the creature's clawed swipes. Her daggers flashed, cutting deep into its ribs, but it barely flinched. "They're tougher than they look." She cursed, rolling back. Thomas grinned. "Then we just hit harder." He reached out, his power unfurling, and his converted wraith spawn lurched forward in response, its violet eyes blazing. It crashed into one of the beasts, both of them tumbling in a flurry of gnashing teeth and flailing claws. Thomas didn't hesitate. He extended a hand, and black tendrils shot from his fingertips, wrapping around another creature's legs. It screeched as he yanked, sending it sprawling onto its back. Then Thomas was on it. His blade sank deep into its skull, crunching through bone. The beast twitched violently, its mouth opening in a silent snarl before it went still. One down. A massive shadow loomed over him. Thomas rolled to the side just as claws slashed through the space where he had been. He barely had time to react before the beast followed up with a savage kick, sending him skidding across the dirt. Pain flared across his ribs, but Thomas just grinned. The Forsaken Lord did not fear pain. He welcomed it. Alara vaulted onto one of the creature's backs, driving both daggers into its skull. She twisted, and the thing convulsed violently before crumpling beneath her. 2 down. Revenant ripped the throat out of another, its snarls wet with blood. 3. Thomas's wraith spawn was losing ground against its opponent. The beast was tearing into it, ripping chunks of corrupted flesh away, ignoring the wraith spawn's claws in return. Thomas didn't hesitate. He extended his hand, and something dark and violent surged within him. The wraith spawn's form twisted, its body shuddering violently. A new notification flashed. Fleshcrafting unlocked. Assimilation. Merge lesser undead with others, strengthening their forms and increasing durability. The wraith spawn twisted violently, its very flesh melting, and then it became part of the beast attacking it. The thing screamed, its body warping as dark veins crawled across its skin, its form reshaping. Its eyes, once burning orange, turned into ghastly violet orbs. And then, it turned. On its own kind. Alara's eyes widened. "Did you just?" Thomas grinned. "I think I did." Their newly corrupted enemy turned against its brethren, ripping into them with twice the fury. 4 down. The remaining beasts hesitated, their confidence shaken. That was all Thomas needed. He surged forward, his blade flashing, his shadows writhing. And the last 2 creatures fell beneath their combined assault. And then, silence. The battlefield was littered with corpses, black ichor staining the ground. Thomas exhaled, his power still humming in his veins, his heartbeat steady and slow. Revenant stood beside him, its fur slick with blood. Alara wiped her daggers on a fallen body, shaking her head. "That was intense." Thomas grinned, his eyes dark with satisfaction. "That was fun." She let out a breathless laugh. "You're a sick bastard." He smirked. "You like it." She didn't deny it. Instead, she sheathed her daggers and gave him a long, appraising look. "You're getting stronger, but I don't think we've seen the full extent of what you can do yet." Thomas flexed his fingers, watching as shadows curled around his skin. "Neither have I." But he was eager to find out. A quiet moment. They made camp under the cover of ancient ruins, the air still thick with the scent of blood. Thomas sat near the fire, cleaning his blade, the flames casting dark shadows across his face. Alara sat beside him, leaning against a broken pillar. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You enjoyed that fight way too much." Thomas smirked. "What gave it away?" The manic grin. "The bloodlust in your eyes. The way you looked like you were about to." She paused, searching for the right words. "Become something else," she finally said. Thomas was silent for a moment, then chuckled. "Maybe I am." Alara tilted her head. "Does that scare you?" He met her gaze. "No." She studied him, then smirked. "Good." He raised an eyebrow. "You like it, don't you?" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "Let's just say, I don't mind a little darkness." Something shifted between them in that moment. Not just trust. Not just camaraderie. Something more. Thomas smirked. "Then stick around. Things are only going to get darker from here." Alara's eyes gleamed. "I wouldn't dream of leaving." And in the flickering firelight, with blood still fresh on their hands, their bond grew stronger. Together, they would carve their place in this brutal world, no matter how dark the path became. Chapter 10. Beneath the ruins, the stench of blood still clung to the air, thick and metallic, but Thomas and Alara barely noticed as they stood at the entrance of the ancient ruins. The crumbling stone walls stretched high above them, covered in twisting veins of black moss that pulsed faintly, almost as if the ruins themselves were alive. Thomas wiped his blade clean on a fallen beast's ragged corpse and sheathed it, glancing toward Alara. "We should see what's inside. No point in letting all this go to waste." Alara stretched, rolling her shoulders. "Looting the dead? Now you're speaking my language." He smirked. "You're disturbingly enthusiastic about this." She gave him a playful shove. "You're one to talk. Mister, I enjoy watching things bleed." Thomas laughed, then turned his gaze toward the darkened archway leading deeper into the ruins. "Let's move, stay sharp." Alara nodded, already slipping into that predatory silence she had whenever she was on high alert. Together, they stepped inside. The heart of the ruins, the inside of the ruins was vast, much larger than Thomas had expected. The ceiling arched overhead, massive pillars carved with strange symbols lining the crumbling hall. Faint blue light seeped through cracks in the stone, illuminating the dust-covered floor. The further they walked, the more they saw evidence of ancient battles, rusted weapons, shattered bones, the occasional faded remnants of spells still lingering in the air like ghosts. Thomas let out a low whistle. Whoever built this place, they didn't go down easy. Alara crouched near an old, broken staff. Mages, by the looks of it. But they lost. She turned the brittle remains of a skeletal hand with her dagger, revealing deep claw marks in the bone. And not to humans. Thomas's eyes darkened. Something tore through them. A faint pulse rippled through his body, his resource identification skill triggering. A notification flickered into view. Ruined Mage's Sanctuary. Decayed, once a stronghold of arcane scholars, now a graveyard for the fallen. The remnants of its magical defenses may still hold power. He frowned. There might still be something worth taking here. Let's split up, cover more ground. Alara hesitated, eyeing the dark corridors ahead. Splitting up in a creepy-ass ruin. What could possibly go wrong? Thomas grinned. Afraid of the dark? She flipped him off before slipping into the shadows. Thomas chuckled, then turned toward the main chamber. A summoner's treasure. The deeper Thomas ventured, the more he felt the echo of magic lingering in the air. He passed through an ornate doorway, stepping into what looked like an abandoned study. Bookshelves lined the walls, most of their contents reduced to dust, but on a stone pedestal in the center of the room, something glowed faintly. A book. Unlike the ruined tomes around it, this one looked pristine, as if time itself had failed to touch it. The leather cover pulsed, like it was breathing. A new notification appeared. Tome of Forbidden Fleshcrafting, a relic of forgotten magic. Contains knowledge of advanced summoning and flesh crafting techniques. Opening this tome will permanently unlock new skills. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. This was exactly what he needed. He reached for it, and something moved. The shadows behind the pedestal stirred, unraveling into a twisted, half-formed entity. A guardian, its body shifting like melting wax, its many eyes blinking in unnatural sequences. Thomas barely had time to react before it lunged. Alara's discovery. Meanwhile, Alara prowled through what seemed to be an armory, stepping over broken weapons and rusted armor. Most of it was useless, too old, too damaged, but then her keen eyes caught something shimmering beneath a pile of rubble. She crouched, brushing aside the debris, and found a dagger unlike any she'd seen before. The blade was dark steel, runes etched down the fuller, and when she touched it, a chill shot up her arm. A notification appeared. Dagger of the Eclipse, a blade forged in shadows. Deals increased damage when attacking from stealth. Can absorb a portion of the victim's life force. Alara grinned. Oh, hell yes. Then she heard the crash. Her head snapped up just in time to hear Thomas curse violently in the distance. Son of a... Alara was already moving. A close call. Thomas hit the ground hard, rolling just as the guardian's amorphous limbs smashed into the stone where he'd been standing. The force of the blow sent cracks splintering through the floor. He lunged to his feet, summoning his shadows to wrap around his arms, enhancing his strength. Revenant appeared beside him, snarling, its fur bristling. The guardian's many eyes locked onto them, its form shifting like living oil. Thomas didn't hesitate. Revenant, tear it apart. The beast lunged, its fangs sinking into the guardian's shifting flesh. The creature screamed, the sound warping, as if a dozen voices were layered over one another. Thomas pressed forward, slashing his blade across its writhing mass, but it was like cutting through water. His attacks barely did anything. Shit. Then, suddenly, a blur of movement. Alara came from above, daggers flashing, her new weapon glowing darkly as she plunged it into one of the guardian's many eyes. The creature shrieked, spasming violently. Alara twisted the blade. You're a tough bastard, huh? The guardian collapsed, its body melting into a pool of black ichor, and then, nothing. The room fell silent. Thomas exhaled. Took your time. Alara smirked. You're welcome, asshole. He grinned. Find anything good? She twirled her dagger. A little something to keep things interesting. Thomas held up the forbidden tome, his eyes gleaming. Same. Alara's smile faded slightly when she saw the book. That looks ominous as fuck. Thomas's grin widened. Good. She studied him for a moment, then shook her head with a chuckle. You are one twisted motherfucker. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. And you like it? Her smirk didn't waver. Maybe I do. Their gazes lingered for a second too long. Something changed in the air between them, something tense, heated, undeniable. Then, Alara broke the moment with a teasing shove. Come on, let's get the hell out of here before you decide to summon some unholy abomination. Thomas laughed. Too late for that. Together, they stepped back into the ruins, their loot secured, their bond deepening, and a new path unfolding before them. The darkness welcomed them, and they embraced it.